This is a PowerPoint for your PowerPoint quiz on decolonization. The context for decolonization was World War II. The fight in World War II against Adolf Hitler revealed the bankruptcy of the idea of social Darwinism. Adolf Hitler had taken what Great Britain, the United States, and the other allies had believed about social Darwinism and had brought it to its ultimate conclusion. He brought it to genocide. Because Britain and the United States had fought against this, they couldn't then go home after the war and justify racial inequalities. So World War II led to a questioning of the racial hierarchy that Europeans had created to justify their colonial possessions. Latin American countries criticized the United States for its interference in their economies. The Arabs criticized Britain and France for their interference in Middle East for oil. And Africans criticized racism, as most evident in the apartheid system in South Africa. In India, in the 1850s, the British had used a civil war to take over India when the Hindus and the Muslims were fighting each other. The Indians had formed the Indian National Congress in 1885 to demand independence. But most people in the Indian National Congress were middle-class Indians who held positions in the British government, and they never really pushed for rapid independence, fearing they would lose their positions of wealth and status. Mahatma Gandhi was born to a middle-class family and was educated in Great Britain. For a time, he served for Britain in World War I in South Africa, where he saw racial inequalities. He then started to learn about nonviolence as a way to oppose British control in India. But Mahatma Gandhi was also opposed to industrialization of India because he believed that it hurt lower caste farmers. He wanted India to return to its days of farming. Gandhi used a mass nonviolent movement and international media to pressure Britain into independence. When the British military murdered over 100 innocent civilians at the Amritsar massacre, Mahatma Gandhi was able to use this in order to pressure Britain in order to leave India. But when Britain left India, they instigated the Muslim community to fear the large Hindu majority. Muslims formed an all-Muslim league under Muhammad Ali Jinnah. When the British left, the Muslims and the Hindus separated. The Muslims went north, eventually forming Muslim Pakistan, and the Hindus went south, forming independent India. This mass migration led to a civil war where 1 million migrants were eventually killed. In South Africa, the Dutch had settled believing that this was their new Jerusalem. They saw the local Zulu tribes as the barbarians. From 1899 to 1902, there were Boer Wars. Wars between the Zulu tribes, the Dutch, and the British. Each one of these had different interests. The British wanted to get hold of gold mines. The Dutch wanted control over the area, especially the Zulu tribes. And the Zulu tribes wanted to maintain control over their own land. In the end, the British resolved this problem by making an agreement with the Dutch, or who eventually became known as the Afrikaners, where the British would get to control gold mines, the Dutch would get to control the local colored population, and the Zulu would be under the control of the Dutch. In response to this, Africans formed the African National Congress in 1912, but it was largely a conservative middle class, like we saw in India. In the 1950s, Nelson Mandela led a much more militant but nonviolent movement against apartheid. Apartheid in South Africa was like segregation in America. Colored people would be separated from white people, but it was far worse there. Africans who lived in South Africa tended to live in places called townships. Townships were incredibly unequal to the areas where white people lived. But black people would have to travel every day into the areas where white people lived to work at the most menial jobs. They were then forced to go back into the townships by a curfew at night. In 1960, the South African government killed innocent protesters at the Sharpeville Township, and they imprisoned Nelson Mandela. In 1976, the government tried to force the Dutch Afrikaner language on Africans. This led to an uprising, and Afrikaners eventually found themselves fighting against local Africans who were fighting in a guerrilla warfare against the South African government. In 1986, the Congress of South Africa organized an international boycott of South Africa. International companies began divesting or giving up their companies and selling them off to South Africans. This gave South Africans huge economic power, and finally in 1991, the South African president de Klerk freed Nelson Mandela from 30 years in Robben prison. Mandela ran and won against de Klerk for the next election for president of South Africa. In the Middle East, we have two different models of decolonization. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk wanted to modernize the country. He brought the traditional Muslim clerics, or ulama, under control of the state. He separated the Muslim religion from the secular state. He barred women from wearing the traditional hijra, or head covering of Islam, and he gave women rights to divorce, education, inheritance, and custody of children. After his death, some of these more radical measures were repealed, but Turkey remained a much more secular state within the Middle East, with Islam practiced in private life and the state itself remaining much more non-religious. In Iran, it was just the opposite. In the 1950s, the United States replaced the socialist Mohammad Mossadegh and replaced him with Shah Pahlavi. Pahlavi tried to modernize Iran by redistributing the ulama's lands, secularizing some Sharia law, and providing women with education. His secret force called the Savak abused socialists, Muslims, and liberals, and in 1979 this led to a revolution in which a coalition of communists, socialists, liberals, and Muslims replaced Shah Pahlavi. However, the Shiite Muslim who led this group, called the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, eventually imprisoned all communists, socialists, and liberals and led a Shiite radical Muslim state to take over Iran. So decolonization had many positives for countries as they gained their independence, but it also led to massive problems. The countries tended to form military dictatorships. Partially this was due to a lack of experience with democracy. It was also due to a lack of multi-party systems. And this military rule took over in 40 of these major states. Another explanation is neo-imperialism. Countries today are competing for investment. This means they have to lower taxes and regulations. This allows for multinational companies from the first world or developed world to dominate local industries and hire cheap labor. The effect is a lack of local capital for building businesses. This makes the third world or developing world dependent on the first world or developed world investors.